So today we are reading Canto 3, Chapter 15, Text 8. Yasya vacha praja sarvam. Yasya vacha praja sarvam. Gavastan triyevya yantrita. Gavastan yeva yantrita. Haranti balim ayatas. Haranti balim ayatas. Tasmai mukyayate namaha. Tasmai mukyayate namaha. Yasya vacha praja sarva. Gavastant yeva yantritaha. Haranti balim ayatas. Tasmai mukyayate namaha. Yasya vacha praja sarvam. Gavastant-yeva yantritaha. Haranti balim ayatas. Tasmai mukyayate namaha. Yasya vacha praja sarvam. Gavastant-yeva yantritaha. Haranti bahayatas. Tasmai mukyayate namaha.
Yasya vacha praja sarva.
Yasya vacha praja sarva.
Gavastant-yeva yantrita.
Gavastant-yeva yantrita.
Haranti balim ayatas.
Haranti balim ayatas.
Tasmai mukyayate namaha.
Tasmai mukyayate namaha. Ladies. Yasya vacha praja sarva. Gavastant-yeva yantrita. Haranti balim ayatas. Tasmai mukyayate namaha. Yasya vacha praja sarva. Gavastant-yeva yantritaha. Haranti balim ayatas. Tasmai mukyayate namaha. Yasyam. Of whom? Vacha. By the Vedic directions. Prajaha. Living entities. Sarvaha. All. Gavaha. Bulls. Tantya. By a rope. Iva. As. Yantritaha. Are directed. Haranti. Offer. Take away. Balim. Presentation. Ingredients for worship. Ayataha. Under control. Tasmai. Unto him. Mukyaya. Unto the chief person. Te. Unto you. Namaha. Respectful obeisances. So the translation reads, all the living entities within the universe are conducted by the Vedic directions, as a bull is directed by the rope attached to its nose. No one can violate the rules laid down in the Vedic literatures. To the chief person who has contributed the Vedas, we offer our respect. So, responsibly, all living entities within the universe are conducted by the Vedic directions. As a bull is directed by a rope attached to its nose. No one can violate the rules laid down in the Vedic literatures. To the chief person who has contributed the Vedas, we offer our respects. So, here is the purport by Srila Prabhupada. The Vedic literature are the laws of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. One cannot violate the injunctions given in the Vedic literatures any more than one can violate state laws. Any living creature who wants real benefit in life must act according to the direction of the Vedic literature. The conditioned souls who have come to this material world for material sense gratification are regulated by the injunctions of the Vedic literatures. Sense gratification is just like salt. One cannot take too much or too little, but one must take some salt in order to make one's foodstuff palatable. Those conditioned souls who have come to this material world should utilize their senses according to the direction of the Vedic literature. Otherwise, they will be put into a more miserable condition of life. No human being or demigod can enact laws like those of the Vedic literature because the Vedic regulations are prescribed by the Supreme Lord. Yasya vacha praja sarva gavastantyeva yantritaha haranti balam ayatas tasmai mukyayate namaha. All the living entities within the universe are conducted by the Vedic directions as a bull is directed by the rope attached to its nose. No one can violate the rules laid down in the Vedic literatures. To the chief person who has contributed the Vedas, we offer our respect. So the demigods here are offering respect to Lord, I think Brahma, right? That's what's going on here. The Vedic literatures are actually the rules for the universe that we live in. The rules cannot be violated. Of course, they can be violated, but then there's repercussions. They can't be violated without repercussions. I oftentimes think of the rules of the universe, the Vedas, to be something like a soda machine. You know, you put your money in, and you have several options. But if you press the Coca-Cola button, the Coca-Cola will come out, not a 7-Up. You know, so you can make your choice. You can decide not to buy a soda at all. But once you've made your choice, it's a done deal at that time. You can't press the Coca-Cola button and have a 7-Up come out. It won't work like that. So the living entity has a choice at his or her disposal. And that choice is that if you want to flout and ignore the laws of the Vedas, then expect that the material nature is going to carpet bomb you for the rest of your life. You know, if you don't want to have that happen, then you've got the alternative of abiding by the laws of the Vedas, in which case then you'll be free. But you have to choose one of those options. Either you're free from Vedic restrictions and your life is a mess, or you're not free from Vedic restrictions, you voluntarily follow them, and your life is reasonable. As a matter of fact, you become more and more purified. So that's what's there. And it's actually interesting when you think about it, that absolutely everything that happens to us is not accidental. I mean, we are so programmed to think that there's a big mechanical world of material cause and effect that's based on various kinds of probability. But it really isn't like that. The thing that's most conspicuous by its lack of being taken into consideration in the Western world is the law of karma. People are very serious about various physical laws, and people study them in colleges, people get degrees, then people are given, good employment for having understood and assimilated these laws and are able to, if they're able to, apply them in relevant circumstances. But karma is completely ignored, as if somehow or other we can do whatever we want, and all we have to do is be very, very adroit at manipulating the external material energy, and everything will turn out all right. So we can do whatever we want, and if we're good at the controls of material life, then we won't enjoy the blowback of our misdeeds. Somehow or another we'll be able to get around any kind of misdeed by clever manipulation of the material energy. And our whole society is based on this completely false understanding that you don't have to think about the laws of karma, they don't exist, because if you're scientific enough, if you have the controls, if you know the forces at play, the material forces, everything will come out all right. So this doesn't work. Karma will take you to task. And actually, human justice is just the third tier down of the karmic system. We have Krishna's karmic system, which will get you one way or the other. Then you have the demigod's karmic system, which is manipulated and controlled by the demigods, orbiting around Yamaraj, who is the chief of the demigods, who is administering the karmic system. Then below that you have earthly justice, which is usually administered by various governments. And so in this way, if a person acts out, then they're taken to task by one of these levels. So the earthly justice system is just an extension of the demigod justice system, and that's just an extension of Krishna's justice system. And of course we know that sometimes people escape punishment from the earthly system. They're either able to buy their way out, or somehow or another through clever lawyers or whatever it is, they escape punishment. And even sometimes we see that the demigod justice system veers off, and a wrong person is punished, or a right person is failed to be punished. But Krishna's ultimate karmic system never fails. So somewhere along the line, this will be what happens. And so just as a bull is tied through the nose and has to only go so far, because once the bull goes a little bit too far, the rope pulls on the ring in the bull's nose, and that causes pain, so the bull doesn't pull any further. So in this way, the entire world is controlled or oriented by the Vedic system. And to understand this and to live by it is what we all struggle to do, at least those of us who have accepted spiritual life and have made an effort to practice it. Today, of course, is the appearance day of Bhaktivinoda Thakura. And his life is very interesting, actually, for us to study and think about. Because among our Acharyas, there's some interesting things about Bhaktivinoda Thakura's life that are different than many of the other Acharyas. Most of our other Acharyas are devotees who have, actually come up through the Vedic system from the Vaishnava perspective from the very birth. But Bhaktivinoda Thakura was not actually in that category. There was, we say this on a sort of a Leela level, that Bhaktivinoda Thakura, his family on his mother's side were Shakta Worshippers, actually. And on his father's side, there were Vaishnavas. But we see that in the, telling or understanding of his life history, there's a progression of him trying to understand what is the real Vedic system, or what is the real truth. And the system that he grows up with is not satisfactory to him. And not only is the system he grows up with not satisfactory, he finds that the Vaishnava presentation of reality, the one that we study, is so murked down in misunderstanding that he doesn't take it seriously. At least that's the way we hear. So this is something that I personally meditate on a lot, is that we have Lord Chaitanya, what was it, 1486 or something like that to 1530 something. So Lord Chaitanya comes, he gives the Yuga Dharma, the chanting process. Devotees write books. There's a generation after Lord Chaitanya, the devotees like Jiva Goswami, I think our Harivilas mentioned yesterday. And then another generation beyond that, and everything goes downhill. Just that soon, after Lord Chaitanya himself appears, we find the Vaishnava tradition submerged in misunderstanding, where essentially there are very few people who are able to understand it the way it's actually presented. And this is actually a frightening idea, that things can go off the rails this bad, this fast. Basically, within 100, 150 years, we go from Lord Chaitanya and the Vaishnava mission to reclaim the world to a group of people called Vaishnavas that most people think are disreputable. Why do they think they're disreputable? Because they're the Bolas, the Olas, the Gauranga Nagaris, the Atibaris, all these various groups that Bhaktivinoda Thakur mentioned, some 13 of them. And each of them are apparently representing the Vaishnav persuasion of understanding, but none of them in any authentic way are presenting the Vaishnav tradition. All of them have some serious malfunction in their understanding of Krishna consciousness. For the most part, many of these groups are sahajiya-oriented, which means that they want to meditate on Krishna by imitating Krishna, dancing with gopis, or being Krishna, or being the gopis, or something like that, you know. So this is their quote-unquote application of Vaishnavism. They imitate Krishna. Some of them are, groups that are very, very steeped in some smarta tradition which ignores the real goal of the Vedic literatures according to the Vaishnava understanding, and focuses instead on various karma kanda rules and regulations for material happiness. And some have the false idea that spiritual life is the exclusive right of a certain family. And if you're not born in that family, you have no right to give initiation. You have no right to be able to speak on spiritual life, because that family are the only people who can do it. So these three things are not just something that happened, some years ago. These are the perennial ways where the Vaishnava tradition can slide off the rails, either going down the sahajiya tendency towards imagining that we can enjoy various material, sense gratification in the name of Krishna consciousness, usually sex life. That's what the sahajiya tendency is all about. That we engage in sex life and we chant some bhajans at the same time, and this is some kind of representation of spiritual life. Or the smarta idea, where we forget the fact that the real goal of spiritual life is to please Krishna and to leave the material world, and instead we point ourselves at the heavenly planets and enjoying in the material world. Or the caste Goswami concept, where we think in terms of some family or some ethnic background have exclusive rights to controlling spiritual life simply because of their birth. So this is the world that Bhaktivinoda Thakur comes into. He comes into a world where there's no genuine representation of the Vaishnava tradition. In fact, only later in his life, when he approaches his 30s, does Bhaktivinoda Thakur come into contact with a genuine version of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Other than that, he winds up being in contact with various, and there were so many of them, illegitimate presentations of spiritual life. Will this happen to ISKCON? About 5 years ago, Gopal Bhatta and the devotees organizing the ILS, or the ISKCON Leadership Sangha, which happens every other year, did a presentation to the devotees at the ILS. And in that presentation, they made the presentation of studies that have been done by various research groups in the modern world. And the study that the research groups were interested in performing was the study of how organizations with a founder do or do not continue into the future. And do they actually remain true to the founder's original vision, or does that original vision get blurred or lost in some way or another? And the striking thing is that something like out of 1,000 various organizations that were studied, all of which had a strong founder of one kind or another. That founder may not have been a spiritual founder. He might have been, like Walt Disney, or someone who was a very key figure and had a vision of how his company, or how his philosophy, or how his particular approach to some type of human endeavor would be carried out, whether the organizations kept fidelity. And the shocking thing is that something like less than 10% of the organizations that were started by a founder within 50 years had maintained fidelity with the original founder. So the percentage is not high. It's quite low. So why is it then that someone starts out with a vision, something that works, something that changes, and what happens over the years? How does that vision get watered down, strayed, overcome by misinterpretation, misunderstanding? Well, it happens drop by drop, grain by grain. It doesn't happen usually in a big, sudden gush. And so this is something that we all will have to stare down in ISKCON as things go forward. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur faced this. Once, in his 30s, that he came to the conclusion that there was he finally had come into contact with an authentic representation of the Vaishnava tradition, then immediately he became taken with it and began to evangelize on the behalf of Vaishnavism. Previous to that, Bhaktivinoda Thakur had studied Christianity. He'd looked at Islam. He had, understood the Vedas as best he could from the various misrepresented and truncated sources. He grew up in an era where in India, Ram Mohan Roy was at the height of his popularity, popularizing the Brahmos movement, which was a syncretic movement. In other words, it was a blending of various kinds of religions, marrying a scientific sort of outlook with Christianity and having some blending of the Vedas as well, kind of a hodgepodge religion of many different things. At a later point in his life, Bhaktivinoda Thakur became affiliated with the Tagore family, which were a Bengali family of very wealthy, and they were also poets. So these Tagores were very taken with Ram Mohan Roy. However, Bhaktivinoda Thakur never really appreciated Ram Mohan Roy. He spoke against him in many situations. But what was the alternative to Ram Mohan Roy? What could we do? What could we think? In what kind of spiritual doctrine could we find shelter if Ram Mohan Roy's philosophy was not correct? Of course, Ram Mohan Roy, I'm not sure who even thinks about him these days, so whatever he came to give didn't hang around, at least not in any numbers, you know. And this is usually one thing that we know, that in the long run, time will be the great indicator of what flies and what flops. You know, that if something doesn't stand the test of time, then we know that there was something suspicious about it. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur himself was aware that the Vedas had been misrepresented. He was aware that in many cases most people were unaware of the real tradition. We learned something from our grandmothers, and that was a hodgepodge of mostly various cookbook remedies for issues in life, you know, like not having enough money or whatever it was, or not being able to find some good occupation or the right wife or the right husband or something like that. And this is why Krishna consciousness should be understood not just as a group of rules or like a cookbook of recipes. You know, if you look at a cookbook, you see that there are many, many recipes. Some of them are sweets, some of them are savory, some of them may be sabjis. You may have some salads in there, some soups. What's the common thing there? They're all things to eat, but there's no commonality there. So the Vedas are not just a cookbook of various recipes for odd situations that we try to find something similar to. There is a common thread that ties together the Vedas, and we call that the Siddhanta. And this is why we have to understand how what we read in Bhagavad Gita is connected to what we read in Chaitanya Charitamrita, how it is connected to what we read in Srimad Bhagavatam. They are all connected. These ideas are all the same ideas. Like yesterday, Hari Vilas, we was talking about, the idea of recognizing that there are 11 ideas in the Nectar of Instruction, 11 verses. And these 11 verses attempt to crystallize down into a very, very succinct and small way what Krishna consciousness is actually all about. And it's interesting, too, that it starts with very basic principles, just, how one can get general knowledge. And then by the time you're at the 11th verse of the Nectar of Instruction, we're hearing about the rasas, So this is a trend that many Vedic literatures follow. The Bhagavatam works the same way too. We start off with basic stories and understandings about how a devotee should live, what we should do. And then at the end, we're in the 10th canto where we hear actual pastimes of Krishna. So this is a kind of trend in the Vedic literatures. So trying to have a succinct understanding of what is actually important is key. So therefore, there is the detail and the principle. Principles can never be changed. They are eternal. We call them absolute truth. They stand for all time and they're for all people. And these principles, if we alter them, we will be lost. Krishna consciousness will not be Krishna consciousness anymore. And evidently this has happened in the past. It could certainly happen again in the future. Similarly, if we take those things which actually are time, place, and circumstance, and we elevate them to absolute truth where we never change them, exactly the same thing will happen. That in time, Krishna consciousness will become murky again. And we will elevate things that are useful, at least in a particular circumstance, to being things which can never be changed. So, with the progression of time, we are forced to change. We have to change something. So if we don't change those things which are time, place, and circumstance, we will wind up changing those things that are absolute truth. So we will change something. And this is how spiritual organizations become gradually more and more tepid. We become more and more strayed away from what spiritual life actually involves. And we become more of a religious, pious affiliation where, people do pious things, they try to avoid sin, and in general the idea is to be good, and to get some reward in the future. But this is not what Prabhupada came to give. This is not what the Vaishnava system is all about. Of course, Bhaktivinoda Thakura, once he was in his 30s, he has a very interesting life, because he was surrounded by death in so many ways. He was one of, I forget how many children, and the only one that survived, out of, I don't know, something like 8 or 10 children. All of his brothers didn't make it, for one reason or another. The city that he was born in, Ulagram or Burnagar, was a city that was destroyed by cholera. It was a city that at one point became a literal ghost town. That he was not living in Burnagar when this took place, but the city that he was born in was destroyed, and his sister became very ill, his mother became very ill. Eventually his mother died. The family, the Dattas, is actually a very illustrious family in India. And they had a lot of wealth at their disposal. But over time, by mismanagement, this wealth was squandered. And I think by the time Bhaktivinoda Thakura is 12 years old, or 13 or 14 years old, he finds himself the head of the entire household. His father is not living anymore. His mother is deathly ill. None of his older brothers are alive, and he's managing the entire family. And on top of it, they're in financial straits. So He starts off his life as a teacher. He does various teaching positions, and eventually he becomes a magistrate. That happens later on when he's about 27. Bhaktivinoda Thakur has a uncle who is on his father's side, who sends a letter to him at one point and asks to see him. And he says that, I will soon leave this world, so please come and see me. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur journeys to where his uncle is. And when he gets there, first thing he notices is his uncle doesn't appear to be sick. In fact, his uncle is very strong. Mentions that he was able to pull cobras out of holes and kill him with his shoe. He was really a intensely powerful man, and he gives several predictions. He says that you will later on in life become a very important spiritual personality. By the time you're 27, you will have the occupation that you will practically engage in for the rest of your life. And he makes several other predictions about Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And they all came true. And then after explaining this to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, his uncle simply sits down very peacefully and quietly, and his life hair pops out of the top of his head, and he's dead. So he had evidently planned it that way. And over the time, Bhaktivinoda Thakur becomes sandwiched between all these various religious viewpoints. Christianity was entering India in some places. Those who followed Ram Mohan Roy were very vocal, and they were publicizing and promoting him. Meanwhile, the Brahmanas were drastically against Ram Mohan Roy and other such people. And at the same time, we had the rise of various odd preachers, like B.C. Kisan. B.C. Kisan was a Atibari, and the Atibari sect is a sect where people who were Atibaris claim to be either Brahma, Vishnu, or Shiva, and they purport that they are going to kill all the foreigners in India and give India back to the Indians. And some of them had mystic powers, like B.C. Kisan had mystic power. He had a big, huge pile of hair. And it's interesting that this B.C. Kisan had come to the attention of the British government. So Britain had come into India and pushed the Muslims out because they wanted the resources of India, the spices, the gold, all various kinds of natural resources that India had. And so the British East India Company had set up, along with the military, a type of takeover of the government of India, basically pushing out the Muslims who had overtaken at least northern India for about 700 years or something, with Muhammad Ghori being the first to come in and to start to control India from outside. So the British, they were at the controls of India. This was before, of course, Indian independence. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, by the time he was in his 30s, had begun to study Vaishnavism. And at the same time, he was now functioning as a magistrate. He would, like a judge, hear various court trials. And he was a brilliant judge. He was able, it's said that even the British government found him legendary, that he could solve cases in a short time. He immediately could understand what was going on, who was lying, and what the judgment needed to be. And so cases that would drag on for years and years and years, he would resolve them in a day or two. He was just able to cut right down to the bottom line. So the British government were completely behind Bhaktivinoda Thakura. As a matter of fact, at one point, because he was someone who tended to get sick a lot. This is another thing you read about Bhaktivinoda Thakura, that there were many instances in his life where he was either deathly ill or incapacitated due to some kind of illness of one kind or another. He was supposed to debate over the Brahman and Vaishnava issue when the pundits were making this whole big uprising, but he was too sick to go. So Bhaktisiddhanta went. By that time, Bhaktisiddhanta was with us. So Bhaktivinoda Thakura, when he was a child, he was sick many times, but somehow or another he always survived. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakura was sometimes at a great difficulty to get to his occupation. The Indian, the British actually built a railroad just to Bhaktivinoda Thakura's house, so that he could get on the train and come to where he had to work. So there was a line that was just for Bhaktivinoda Thakura. That was how much they valued his ability to deal with things. And so naturally, when the British government discovered that this B.C. Kisan was not only trying to foment an uprising against the British government, but at the same time, he was having sex with the wives of prominent leaders in that part of India, and he had mystic powers where he would have a big convocation where many people would come to hear him. And he would start a big fire, and then he would lean over into the fire, and then he would come out of it, and he would not be burned. He was able to, cause people to have good luck when they asked for it. He did various things. He was able to heal people from various diseases, and so he had quite an intense following. So although he was preaching that I am Vishnu and I will kill all the English, all the foreigners in India, and however, in the local area, and the townspeople, many of them really liked B.C. Kisan because they saw him as a hope. They saw him as a person who was able to demonstrate mystic powers and so on and so forth. So the British government, they talked to Bhaktivinoda Thakura and they asked him, can you do something about B.C. Kisan? And of course, Bhaktivinoda Thakura was mostly interested in the fact that he was claiming to be Vishnu, which we know according to Vedic literatures, there's a good chance B.C. Kisan wasn't Vishnu. So Bhaktivinoda Thakura went to confront B.C. Kisan with a whole group of police, So Bhaktivinoda Thakura, when he first met B.C. Kisan, he had this whole sort of army with him, And B.C. Kisan said, "Why have you come, Thakur? I know already about you." And he gave to Bhaktivinoda Thakura a letter that he'd written down with several predictions about the fact that Bhaktivinoda Thakura would come to him, and what Bhaktivinoda Thakura had in mind, and all these things, and so he was hopefully going to impress Bhaktivinoda Thakura with the fact that he could predict the future and explain to him that he already knew why he was coming. And in this way, Bhaktivinoda Thakura said, well, you may know these things, but you also know that the living entity cannot be the Supreme Lord. The living entity and the Supreme Lord are in two different categories, and you're claiming to be Vishnu. So therefore, I have come to arrest you and to take you to trial. And the B.C. Kisan said, you will never be able to do this. He said, please come to my side and I will make you a minister. And Bhaktivinoda Thakura was not having it. And then B.C. Kisan threatened Bhaktivinoda Thakura that if you persist in this, then you will see my wrath as Vishnu. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakura came back the next day, and they had a paddy wagon, and they demanded B.C. Kisan come. And so they put B.C. Kisan in the paddy wagon and began to take him away, and his followers were saying, oh, injustice, injustice. How can you do this to Vishnu? And so there was all this, enormous amount of, protest. And B.C. Kisan said to them, I am just doing what my devotee wants me to do. So that was, B.C. Kisan's rejoinder for what was taking place. And of course, there was a trial. And Bhaktivinoda Thakura was the judge at the trial. And about 2 days into the trial, B.C. Kisan in the courtroom said, just see what I am doing at your home, Bhaktivinoda Thakura. And one of Bhaktivinoda Thakura's children had gotten very sick. And when he went home, his wife pleaded with Bhaktivinoda Thakura, please, our child will die if you don't give up this case with B.C. Kisan. And Bhaktivinoda Thakura said, let us all die, but this fraud has to be brought to justice. So the next day, B.C. Kisan himself, the next day, Bhaktivinoda Thakura became very sick. In fact, on the day that he had to give the verdict of the trial, he had to be carried to the courtroom on a stretcher. He was so ill. But the verdict was, of course, that B.C. Kisan was guilty of impersonating Vishnu, of sedition against the government, and also impropriety with others' wives, and that he would have to go to jail. And one of the British ministers that was working with B.C. Kisan had read about yogis, and he learned that oftentimes yogis keep their mystic power in their hair, and B.C. Kisan had this huge hair. And so he had brought some clippers, and once the verdict was delivered, this minister clipped off B.C. Kisan's hair, and B.C. Kisan fell unconscious to the ground. And so here all these people that were claiming, how can you do this to Vishnu, how can you take him away, suddenly saw their Vishnu with no hair and collapsed on the ground. And then he was imprisoned. I don't know what the duration was. It wasn't a huge duration of time that B.C. Kisan would have had to spend in jail. But B.C. Kisan, I think either he took poison or something and he died in jail, so he never came out of jail. And he had a Brahma and a Shiva with him that also Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to similarly take to trial, and they also were demoted from their position as Brahma and Shiva. So this shows how when religion is misunderstood or misapplied, it becomes something that's really devastating. And this is actually what was happening, many times in this time that Bhaktivinoda Thakur lived. In fact, he prayed very sincerely that a ray of Vishnu could come to him, and this ray of Vishnu would help him to untangle all these misconceptions that had grown up about the Vaishnava tradition. Of course, that ray of Vishnu would be, I think, his fourth or fifth child, who was Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Bimala Prasad. So this is why Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to go into a literary war with all these various groups that were misrepresenting. There were the Bolas and the Olas. These were groups who would perform kirtan, but basically they were just having these big conventions where all of them would come together, and they would meet ladies, and they would have various kinds of they would engage in sex life with the ladies, and they would travel with a consort, as they called it, for some time. And then later on, in another big sangha, they would switch consorts, and this was the Bolas and the Olas. They were musical, and they were giving this as a representation of how a person can become spiritually purified by imitating Krishna in many different ways. There were other groups who had the idea that they would either dress like gopis, the Saki Bekis, the men who would dress like gopis, and then they would engage in activities like the gopis. And then there was another group that would dress like Krishna. So these two groups would get together, and you would have the people who were imitating gopis around the people who were imitating Krishna. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur mentions these 13-some different groups. There was the Atibaris, as we just heard about, B.C. Kisan. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur wrote a whole newspaper article about the Atibaris, exposing them and explaining how they had no basis in any scripture, though they might have some mystic potencies. So in this way, Bhaktivinoda Thakur really had his hands full, and he began something that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati would continue, this explaining and clarifying what Krishna consciousness actually is, restoring the Bhagavatam, the Chaitanya Charitamrita, and speaking against this flood. Especially in Bengal, there was a group of publishers called the Bharatalas who were keen on publishing any kind of literature about Lord Chaitanya. And most of it was, made up things, and oftentimes even very scandalous things, So there are literatures that people, even in Lord Chaitanya's time, wrote that misrepresented Lord Chaitanya and misrepresented the philosophy that Lord Chaitanya came to give, and even what Lord Chaitanya did. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to write he was a prolific writer. He wrote books like the Harinam Chintamani and many other writings. When he was younger, he wrote a whole long epic called the Puriad about a hero named Porus who fought with Alexander the Great, and he wrote about life and death and the meaning of things. And he wrote poems, and in his later days, he was writing as much as he could various expositions of the proper understanding of the Vaishnava tradition. Of course, towards the latter part of his life, Bhaktivinoda Thakur disconnected from everything. He took Babaji Vesh, and he retreated into a bhajan kutir. And then that was the way that he left the world. That at one point during his chanting, he simply left his body. And so these are a few sort of summaries or a brief kind of representation of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And since we don't have breakfast, maybe if anybody has any questions, we can try to answer them, or else we can adjourn if nobody has questions. Yes, Hadai.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you very much for the class. I like this point you're mentioning, I heard this before, about conservative about the principles and liberal with the details, but when we become conservative with the details and liberal about the principles, havoc runs loose. I was just wondering, I really like that point. I was just wondering one question about, we see that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had this organization. I was reading somewhere that there's a difference between one of the other son of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Lalit Prasad, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. While Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur wanted a more organized, like an organized movement, like the Gaudiya Math, while Lalit Prasad was more on the other side and kind of had individualism. And I was just wondering, what was Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's emphasis on organized spirituality, like how we have the Gaudiya Math and ISKCON by Srila Prabhupada? What was Srila Bhaktivinoda's mood of how Krishna consciousness would be spread? Because I know he had the Namhata idea, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, as far as I know, I don't think that Bhaktivinoda Thakur, I know that there were periods of time where he would preach in a particular location and give classes, and people would come and attend those classes. But as far as I know, I don't think he ever had any kind of organization around him. Bhaktisiddhanta, on the other side of the coin, was quite strong with that. And that may have been why Bhaktivinoda Thakur didn't do it, because his son did it, And of course, Bhaktivinoda Thakur in our line was probably the last one to take Babaji Vesh, and Bhaktisiddhanta started the trend of devotees in the later part of their lives becoming, instead of Babajis, becoming sannyasis, and not leaving to do some kind of nirjana bhajan, but actually becoming Goshtiyanandis, not Bhajananandis. So even as far back as Jiva Goswami, there was the idea of a worldwide organization, which is, I think, important for us to focus in on. That if you read Bhagavatam, you won't read anything about a GBC or a organization or any of those kind of things. However, the idea of an organization working together to blanket the entire globe with Krishna consciousness, particularly the chanting of the holy name, was a theme. And originally it was called the Vishva Vaishnava Raja Sabha. And by the time we get to Bhaktivinoda Thakura, actually Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, he changed it to the Gaudiya Math, and then Prabhupada changed it to ISKCON. So this same concept of a worldwide unity of people preaching has many difficulties how to implement it, because there is no clear explanation for how such an organization would be managed or how it functions exactly. So we know that Bhakti Siddhanta was the one who actually came up with the concept of a GBC. And of course Prabhupada implemented it as well. And these are all innovations in the process of spreading Krishna consciousness. That means that what we have to follow the Vaishnava principles as much as we can, but we also have to figure out how to accommodate a worldwide organization, which is where in modern ISKCON we get this pull and push between a central GBC that legislates and makes various pronouncements on overall policy, and we have individual gurus who have, their recommendations to their disciples, etc., etc. So this is a little bit confusing. However, if there is a good working relationship among the people involved, usually this doesn't lead to any problem. So the point that I was making about the future of ISKCON is being able to understand, and really, if you look at it, there are not so many things that are absolute. In the course known as hermeneutics that is being offered now in many places in ISKCON gets into this exact discussion of what is a practical exposition of our Siddhanta. And, our Siddhanta, you could put it into, a couple of pages, It's not all over the place. What then is the rest of Bhagavatam? What is the rest of Chaitanya Charitamrita? The rest of it is application of the Siddhanta, the unalterable principles. We know that one has to have a spiritual master. That's, there. We know that Krishna is blue. We know that living entities come from the spiritual world. They are not equal to the Supreme. They are simply parts and parcels of Him. We know that when the living entities decide that they want to enjoy on their own, they have to leave the spiritual world. These are all absolutes. But as far as, how exactly we become initiated, exactly, how many rounds we chant, how all these other things, these are various applications. And so things can be adjusted as time goes on. We see the whole Varnashram system has been adjusted on a number of occasions in different ways. When Prabhupada came to the Western world, he allowed ladies to live in the temple, whereas in India this was never done before. In traditional Varnashram Dharma, you have a king, whereas Bhaktisiddhanta and Prabhupada wanted a GBC instead of a single individual person. So all these modifications are there, and these are applications of the Siddhanta. So when we're reading scripture, we have to understand whether what we're reading is actually unalterable, and it is fundamental Krishna consciousness, or it's an application of those things that are fundamental and unalterable. Because if we mix the two, then we will find that Krishna consciousness becomes impractical, and it becomes confusing, and it becomes contradictory, self-contradictory. And that's how we sort things out and keep them straight. The question is, will we be able to do this in the future? As the years cross by, will we remain true to the fundamental Siddhanta, the core principles of spiritual life, and adjust when necessary, but not when not necessary, adjust when necessary, various applications and practical policies that help shore up and promote the Vaishnava Siddhanta. If we can do that, then we will keep the preaching spirit, we will remain relevant, we will remain practical, and we won't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We won't wind up coming up with ideas that are contrary to the Siddhanta, which will eventually bankrupt the spiritual process of Krishna consciousness. Understanding the difference between the two will definitely require study, and this is why I keep making a strong point out of the idea that we should not understand Krishna consciousness as a cookbook of 1,000 different recipes, but rather we should understand the principles that unite those different recipes and what is the fundamental behind them. So, okay. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Rajmo. Have him speak into the mic. I heard it, but our folks...
Was Vishva Vaishnava Raj Sabha coined by Bhaktivinoda Thakura, or was that present before?
I think it was actually coined by Bhaktisiddhanta, but there was a, it might have been around before that. At least there was some notion of a worldwide organization. I'm not sure whether Vishva Vaishnava Raja Sabha goes back before. At least the concept goes back. Whether the name goes back, I'm not clear on that. I don't remember. But it is written down somewhere, so. Okay, so thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord, all glories to Bhaktivinoda Thakur and to A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.